Hello, this is Lee Freilich, Director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology and resident of the downtown Minneapolis Loring Park neighborhood. Today I'm going to talk about biodiversity and pollinators in the urban environment of Minneapolis. Let's look at the context in which Minneapolis sits. If you look at the white symbol on this map, it sits right in the middle of an area mapped as red, which is unnatural. That means that it's been dramatically modified by European settlement, and what happened is not only was the city built, but the entire rural landscape for miles in every direction around us has been converted to cornfields and other agricultural fields, and a lot of forests have been cut down. So it's a very heavily modified landscape that has relatively little biodiversity, and that elevates the importance of what biodiversity we have in the city. Stewardship of the planet by humans is very important. The only way we can get people to care about native species is if they see them and interact with them, and most people live in urban environments. So that also elevates the importance of biodiversity in the city. What types of natural environments did we have before European settlement? Well, we had two. The first was oak savanna, prairie grasses and forbs, things like sunflowers and coneflowers, interspersed with groves of oak trees, primarily bur oak, pin oak, and white oak. We also had on the richer soils the so-called bigwoods forest with sugar maple, basswood, and red oak. This example being Woodrill Scientific and Natural Area in the western suburb of Orono, Minnesota. There are many hundreds of native plant species in these forests and savannas: trilliums, columbine, asters, goldenrods, violets, geraniums, milkweeds, bloodroot. Many plants that we need to take care of in the future and make sure that they have a place to grow. Plants are the base of the trophic pyramid, and here you can see at the base the primary producers. That would be plants. They take in carbon dioxide from the air and sunlight and use that to grow, and then the plants themselves are food for herbivores like rabbits and deer, which then are food for carnivores like fox and wolves and so on that are higher up the food web. The problem with urban areas is that the food web is restricted to a small area. We have a relatively small trophic pyramid, so much of the area is converted to buildings and streets and other hardscapes, that the base of the pyramid isn't very big, and therefore it can't support a lot of species higher up in the pyramid. So it's important to maintain what green space we do have and have a lot of species there so that we can have a very diverse environment in the city. Research at the University of Delaware by Doug Ptolemy and his colleagues shows that native and non-native plants are not equal in their abilities to support the food web. So not only do we have a lot of the area occupied by buildings and streets, but non-native plants occupy some of the green space at the expense of native plants. In this example, the oaks, which are shown in the background of the picture, harbor many insect species, whereas the non-native ginkgo tree, which is the bright yellow tree in this autumn picture, harbors only a few insects. If you look at this from the point of view of a bird like chickadees, they need thousands of caterpillars in one season to feed their offspring, and ginkgos are not going to provide that, whereas the native oaks could. So native plant gardens are important because they create ecological function, which includes ecological services like clean air, clean water, moderating floods, pollination, and also maintaining biodiversity. By supporting pollinators, which support plants, and then the pollinators and plants support each other and provide food webs that support birds and wildlife species. The greater the complexity of native plant gardens, the more stable the food webs will be and the more species of pollinators and of wildlife we will be able to have. When we think of pollinators, usually the honeybee comes to mind. That's only one species and not even native at that. Honeybees are from Europe. If you look at our native pollinators, we have more than 400 native bee species. We have hundreds of beetles, hundreds of fly species, and many, many hundreds of butterflies and moths that are all important for pollinating plants. Plants of all sizes and shapes and pollinators of all sizes and shapes that mutually support each other. Some of the guidelines for a good native plant garden would be to have at least 3 native plant species in bloom throughout the season. And because a lot of plants bloom early or in the middle of the season or late, we're talking about at least 9 or 10 species of plants, so that pollinators have something to visit throughout the entire growing season. Gardens should be in the sun and in the shade, and we should consider bee-friendly lawns. There are a lot of small plant species that can be mowed and walked on, but that also support pollinators. And because lawns occupy such a big proportion of green space, it's important that we consider the diversity of plant species in our lawns as well as in gardens. A lot of people prefer mowed lawns, which, as I just said, can support pollinators. However, people want more biodiversity than that in an increasingly urbanized world. So we should make room for our native prairie plants that are taller. Maybe we shouldn't plant trees in every single spot. We should have some sunny areas for our native prairie plants in addition to our plants that grow in the shade. Linkages among native plant sites in the city are important so that it can function like a natural contiguous landscape. In this picture, flowers grow everywhere, pollinators can go everywhere, whereas in the city, we're talking about a few isolated little pieces of vegetation, and the question is, can pollinators fly from one to the other and provide those linkages of cross-pollination that will maintain the plant species in a healthy condition? Pollinators, therefore, can be viewed as an umbrella group. If we take care of the pollinators and the plants that they need, together they reinforce each other. They are the base of the trophic pyramid in the food web that supports all other native species. Minneapolis has pretty good linkages through the city through its parkway system. However, much of the inner city is not linked to the parkways, and we need to fill that remaining space with smaller gardens. The Loring Greenway is an example. In this picture, the Loring Greenway is actually behind the Hyatt Hotel. You'd never know there was a greenway a quarter-mile long in there with many green spaces and garden beds, but it is there, and it provides critical space for pollinators to exist and is a critical linkage within the city. This is my scheme for a potential network of native plant pollinator gardens in downtown Minneapolis, represented by the orange stars that either exist or that could exist in the future. The Loring Greenway from the previous slide is shown by the green arrow in the lower left. The blue arrows show other connections that could occur among native plant species gardens, places where pollinators could fly and transfer pollen from one garden to another, or birds or other wildlife species could disperse the seeds from one garden to another. One of the best examples of a native plant garden is the Queen's Garden at Buckingham Palace in London. The garden does have large areas of lawn where formal events take place. It has beds of non-native plants that are there just for the showy nature of the flowers. But if you look in the lower picture, in the background, it also has what the Queen calls the wild area. In this wild area, a number of sustainable management practices are carried out, shown here in royal purple from the royal website. Many native plant species have brought in over the years, and there are now 320 wildflower species, 2,500 insects, 1,500 fungi. Very diverse place that now supports a lot of birds and other wildlife species. This is an aerial view of London. That garden is located where the white symbol is, right in the middle of one of the largest and densest urban areas on the planet. And so if biodiversity can exist there, it can certainly exist in Minneapolis. The Queen may have more money than we do, but in Minneapolis we have a lot of people who care about native plants and a lot of places where we can plant them. So if you have any questions, you can contact me at the email address shown here. And remember, biodiversity is the real wealth in the universe. Every morsel of food that every person on the planet has ever eaten was either a plant or an animal that needed a plant in order to grow, and therefore we can't exist without biodiversity. All of the plant species that we have contributed to the evolution of our crop species and the evolution of humans as a species. So our society is a product of biodiversity and cannot exist without it. Thank you for listening.